Hello again, and this is the second of the guides I'm going to be doing for the Fjällräven Classic Sweden 2025 Facebook page. The last one I did was on personal hygiene. This one is about tents, specifically tent selection. So, as I mentioned in the previous one, these guides are really aimed at the people who are new to trekking, hiking, camping, and all parts of it. How valuable it'll be for people who are already experienced, well, probably not a great deal, but there may be something in there for everyone. So when it comes to tent selection, there's a bunch of things to consider. It's one of those questions, like with all equipment, where if you ask the question, what's the best tent, or what's the best boots, or what's the best backpack, ask 10 different people, you'll get 10 different answers. So asking what the best of something is probably not the best question to ask. Better to have an idea of what tent you want and then ask questions about specific tents. Has anyone got experience of this tent? Has everyone used this tent? And what do you think about this tent in, harsh wind or whatever it may be? They're probably better questions. What I'll do is I'll cover broadly the different types of tent you can get and a couple of pros and cons of the different types as well. So I'm not going to go into like massive depth because I don't want it to be a really long and dragged out sort of video. So I won't ramble on. I'll get straight into it. So fundamentally, there's tents fall into one of three main categories. They're either dome tents, tunnel tents, or trekking pole tents. There are others. There's hundreds and hundreds of tents out there these days, and there's all combinations of different types of material and poles and pegs and even guy lines. Like it's massive. The selection you've got now is huge. But fundamentally, all tents fall pretty much into one of those three categories. So I'll do a little bit on each one with the pros and cons, as I say, and then a little bit more information at the end that hopefully will be useful to people. So the first type of tent I want to talk about are dome tents. Now, dome tents are a good all-round tent. You can get different variations of them, like lots of different variations. You can get a 2-pole dome tent, a split pole, a 3-pole, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pole. It just depends how big the tent is, essentially. There's a few advantages to dome tents and there's a few disadvantages, as with every tent. With domes, your interior living space tends to be a lot bigger. They're often a little bit higher than a tunnel tent, so you've got more headroom. And because of the shape, being a dome, all of the space is usable, all of it, and it's all accessible. And so you can move around quite freely inside them. The vestibules tend to be quite large as well, so you can cook your meals in there, hang clothes, store your kit. The other real benefits of dome tents is that they're pretty good in wind. They're very good at snow loading, which shouldn't really be an issue in Sweden in August, but you never do know. And the other benefit really is when you pitch them, the wind isn't as much of a factor as to which way around you pitch them. Now, like for your 2 poles and your split poles, a lot of manufacturers will tell you to pitch them end on into the wind, so that gives you 2 options. With the true domes, the 3 poles and upwards that are circular, it doesn't really matter that much. So you've got more flexibility in terms of your direction of pitch. The downside to dome tents is because of the size and the shape of them, they can often have a lot more material, which means they're generally heavier. Not always the case. There are some exceptionally light dome tents out there. The split pole variation and the 2 pole, that's weight saving really, but they're still very good solid tents. And there's other things they do to save weight. So you can get some dome tents, what would be categorized as a dome tent, that are coming in at like 1.2 to 1.4 kilograms, which is very, very light for a dome. But fundamentally, the majority of dome tents are a little bit heavier. And their pack size, consequently, because of the increased material, tends to be a little bit bigger. And maybe you're carrying that extra pole as well. And they can sometimes be a little bit complicated to pitch because you've got to get the poles in the right orientation and things. But with practice, that becomes less of an issue, to the point it becomes not an issue. So that's your dome tents. And like I say, there's any number of variations of them. Personally, the split poles, whilst they do a lot to save weight and they're quite clever structures, you'll get some of them that have like a short crossing pole that doesn't go to ground. I'm not a fan of them because I just don't think they offer anything apart from lifting the sides up, which under wind, I've seen that top pole flipping in. It's personal preference at the end of the day, like with all tents. But yeah, a true dome tent is a pretty comfortable, solid tent to be in. As I say, it's a slight trade-off in some cases with the weight versus the livability, if you want to call it that. So the next type of tent to talk about are tunnel tents. Now, tunnel tents, again, the variation in tunnel tents is vast. You've got single pole tunnels, double poles, triple poles, quad poles, twin poles, and on upwards. You'll see sort of single pole tents tend to be 1 man, 2 man max. I mean, there are some exceptions to that rule, but mostly 1 or 2, predominantly 1, I would say. Things like the Fjällräven Abisko Light 1 or the Top 10 Scarp 1. You can get a Top 10 Scarp 2, which is a single pole tunnel. With the single pole tunnels, again, like with the 2 pole domes, a lot of manufacturers will tell you to pitch end into the wind, not the sides. So you have 2 options there. With the longer tunnel tents, like your 2 poles, 3 poles and upwards, you're a little bit more restricted in terms of your pitch orientation, because for the most part you want to be putting the vestibule end into the wind. And you have, with the longer tunnel tents, 1 vestibule, so that's 1 end into the wind. So you've got 1 option. The reason for that is, if you've got the 2 pitched ends like this and the tunnel part in the middle, you're living in one part and then you've got the vestibule. So where that vestibule is, if the wind deflection pushes it in, it's not touching anything. On the tail end, where your feet are, if that gets pushed in, because the inner and the outer are very close and it pushes, you can transfer water from there to there and it gets the inner of the tent wet. Not great. So that's one of the downsides of tunnel tents. The other downside really is that because of the orientation of the way you sleep inside it as well, you've got to be a bit more conscious of how you're pitching on the ground. So if the ground's got a slope, you don't want your feet at the bottom of your head at the bottom of the slope and your feet at the top. You want it the other way around. Otherwise, the blood's going to run to your head during the night, and you ain't going to get the best night's sleep. I've done it, and it's not nice. So you kind of want your head higher than your feet. So when you take that into consideration with the direction of wind, that can be quite tricky. On the plus side, in Sweden, the amount of places you can actually pitch is vast. So you're not really going to struggle that much in that scenario. So tunnel tents aren't one of the really big disadvantages. Isn't so much of a disadvantage in Sweden, if that makes sense. The main advantages of tunnel tents are that they still have a very good livable space inside. They tend to be a little bit shorter on the head height. They have a big vestibule, so you've got a lot of space to store equipment, food, cook your food, hang clothes and things like that. They're generally very easy to pitch because the fly sheet tends to have pole sleeves, so you just slide the right coloured pole into the sleeves, and there's only like 2 of them generally, or 3. And once you push them in, a couple of pegs at each end, pull it taut and it's up, and then you just add in the guy lines to add tension. But fundamentally, they're pretty easy to pitch, pretty straightforward. And so the main benefit of tunnel tents, more than anything really, I guess, is that they have a very high interior space to weight ratio. So for the amount of weight you're carrying, you get a lot of room inside. The pack size tends to be quite small, or can be compressed quite small. So that's another benefit, I guess. And that's your tunnel tents really. There's no more to say about them. They are very strong in the wind. Snow loading, not so much, because the poles aren't crossing, so there isn't the stability there. But as I say, in the wind, which is probably the more likely of the scenarios, they are very, very good performing. I mean, there's tunnel tents on YouTube. You can see videos of them up to like nearly 80 miles an hour, which is 120 odd kilometers an hour. So they will stand up to wind, very good, a very strong wind. And that's your tunnel tents. And the last type of tent to talk about are trekking pole tents. Now, trekking pole tents are, generally speaking, the lightest of your tents. You can get something like a Lanshan 1 Pro, which will come in at, I think it's about 650 grams, which is nothing really for a tent, a double skin tent. The plus points of trekking pole tents is the weight. They are super simple to pitch, generally speaking. Once you've practiced a few times, they are like super fast. I used the Durston X Mid 2 on the Classic last year, and I'd practiced a lot with that tent because when I first got it, I found it a bit fiddly. Once I'd mastered it, I could get that tent up and get my gear inside a minute and a half. So it doesn't take long at all. And there was videos of guys on YouTube doing it way faster than me. So they are easy to pitch, they are quick to pitch, and they're light. The downsides of trekking pole tents, although they have a very high internal height, sometimes as high as 130 centimetres, so you've got a lot of headroom, because they're very steep sloped to the ground, in the bottom corners, you lose a lot of usable space. Like, you can put some bits of a kit and equipment in there for storage, if you like, but you can't really live in them spaces. So your livable space is quite restricted. And on some of them, especially if you're a tall person, when you're lying down on your air mat to go to sleep at night, the fly sheet is like right next to your face, if not touching your face. So it just feels a bit uncomfortable at times. They tend to have a very big footprint, but then, like as I say, a bunch of that space is kind of restricted in how you can use it. So you need to have the big footprint to compensate for what you're losing. The other downside to trekking pole tents is that they're not as stable or strong as domes or tunnel tents. They're just not. They will stand up to decent levels of wind. I mean, the Durston did over 40 mile an hour it managed in Sweden at Singi last year. But I wouldn't really trust it much more than that, to be honest with you. Tunnels and domes I would trust a lot more, but again, this is just my personal experience. Now, in terms of the weight of these things, like something that needs to be considered that doesn't ever really get talked about much, and I think it should, because I think it's important to know. If you are a person who does not hike with trekking poles, you never use them, so you wouldn't carry them. If you get a trekking pole tent, you now have to carry trekking poles. So what was a 650 gram ultralight tent is no longer a 650 gram ultralight tent, because the weight of your trekking poles, even light trekking poles, tend to be like 200 grams each. So at the best case scenario, you're up to a kilo with a tent. Now, there are tunnel tents and dome tents that are around the same weight, so you're not gaining anything if that's the scenario. If you're a person who does hike with trekking poles all the time, then absolutely you're getting a very light shelter because you're already carrying them poles, you've already accounted for them. So that's something to consider if you're not a trekking pole user. Is a trekking pole tent the right option? You know, could you not get a stronger, better, bigger tent for a similar kind of total weight? So that's your trekking pole tents. And like I say, there's any number of variations on the designs. I mean, the Durston X Mid, the Top 10 Stratospire. There's another one called Astige Yonchan, which is the same design essentially, but it's a budget version. They're very cleverly designed inside, so they offset the inner to give you more legroom, more livable space, things like that. And they're a great looking tent. But again, a personal preference, I still would move away from a trekking pole tent, but some people absolutely adore them. And if you're doing a solo hike where you've got to carry everything for a week, and you're out in the middle of nowhere and you want the minimum pack weight possible and you hike with trekking poles, fill your boots, go for a trekking pole tent because it ticks a lot of boxes. And that's essentially the three main types of tent. There are a bunch of other things that you can consider as well when it comes to tents, such as what material it's made from. Broadly speaking, you've got 4 stages of material. So at one end, the heavy end, you've got polycotton or canvas, whichever you want to call it, which is essentially the same sort of material as Fjällräven G1000 fabric, but generally speaking, it's a heavier gauge. And that is a pretty substantially heavy tent. The pack size tends not to be very small in that, and they're not as waterproof. They're weatherproof, but they're not as waterproof. The plus sides of a polycotton tent are that it's quieter in the wind, it doesn't flop about so much. They're a lot more durable than the other materials, like abrasion resistance and things like that. And that's pretty much it, to be honest with you. The next level, if you like, is nylon and polyester. And these are the sort of heavy duty Oxford type fabric, which is a great durable tent. They can be very strong as well. But again, they're heavy and they're bulky because it's thick material. The next level up from that, you're looking at sil nylon, sil poly. Now, they're essentially the same as the nylon and poly, but thinner, lighter, much smaller in their packing size, but they tend to be just as strong, more waterproof because they're impregnated with silicon, or they have like layers of silicon on the outer shell. Those are by far, I would say, the most common tents that you'll find, especially among the sort of mid and upper range tents. They're very light and they do the same job as nylon and polyester, but just in a better quality of material. Of the two, of sil nylon and sil poly, most that you'll see are probably sil nylon. There's a lot more manufacturers are starting to bring in sil poly because its main advantage over sil nylon is the fact that it does not sag when it gets wet, whereas sil nylon does. And it can sag by up to 15%, which is quite a lot over the span of a big tent. So if you've got sil poly that doesn't sag, you're less likely to have to get up in the middle of the night and retension your tent because it's sagging. And that's those two. The last one that's worth mentioning, really, I mean, there's other ones out there, hybrid type ones, but the other one that's worth mentioning that is becoming very common amongst ultralight backpackers, has been for a few years now, is DCF, which is Dyneema composite fabric, or Cuban fibre it gets called as well, or just Dyneema. Essentially, it's Dyneema fibres made cloth. So Dyneema is, as far as I'm aware, it's the strongest man-made fibre in the world. And so they've made it into material. So consequently, it is very strong, but it's also super light. It's waterproof as well. So you're thinking, well, it's so much better than the others. What's the downside? Well, the downside is cost. Very expensive. So if you had a manufacturer that makes a tent out of sil poly and a one that makes the same tent out of DCF, you can pay anything from like 30% more up to 100% more for the DCF tent. It is a lot more expensive. Is it worth it? Personally speaking, I don't think it is because it's not that much lighter. Yes, it's stronger, but sil poly and sil nylon are very strong anyway. I mean, if you took Curlon 1600 that Hilleberg make, that's got a tear strength of 16 kilograms, which is huge for a tent fly. So is it worth paying the extra money for? That's a question you would have to ask yourself. Personally, I don't think it is, but some people swear by it. The other downsides to DCF, in my opinion, are that it can be very loud in wind because it's almost plasticky, almost rustly. And if you're on a trek with 500 other people, which we will be in Sweden, some DCF tents are almost transparent. Like you can't see specific details. You couldn't read a note page through there, but you can see enough. And if somebody's in there getting changed and naked, you might cop a bit more of an eyeful than you fancied. So they're great as individuals on a trek where there's nobody else about, then it doesn't matter. But on a trek like Sweden, something to consider. I could go into detail all day about the merits of different poles. All I'll say is, generally speaking, it's either aluminium alloy or carbon fibre. Now, my personal preference is aluminium alloy. It's more flexible than carbon fibre. Carbon fibre is lighter and stronger, but when it breaks, and it can utterly destroy your fly sheet because it can shatter. And then trying to get it out of that fly sheet, you could end up doing more damage than anything else, trying to rescue it. With aluminium, it'll bend and flex and often come back to where it was. If it stays bent, you can actually straighten them out again. It's a bit fiddly, but you can do it. If it bends properly, like creases, if you've got a drinking straw and folded it, you get that type of situation. Even that's salvageable because you can straighten it out. Yes, it'll probably break, but you'll get, in most tents, you'll get a repair sleeve, which is essentially a larger diameter tube that you straighten the pole up, slide the tube on, and you can put a couple of bits of tape to hold it in place. Yes, it's not perfect, but it will keep the tent usable until you can get a proper repair, another pole section. So that's why I prefer aluminium alloy. Now, when you're looking at the aluminium tent poles, you've got everything from the really cheap stuff all the way up to DAC NSF or DAC NFL featherlights, which are, for me, the gold standard of aluminium tent poles. Generally speaking, whatever tent you buy, the poles you get with it is what you've got, but you can upgrade them. You could easily go out and buy some DACs, cut them to the right length, and you've improved the poles. You know, let's say that the tent you got was a budget one with 6000 series aluminium. Upgrading to DACs, it's not super cheap, but it'll still be cheaper than buying a DAC tent. And you've massively improved the structure of the tent. You can get chains out the tent pegs or tent stakes, whatever you want to call them. Some people like MSR ground dogs. Some people like fee stakes. There's any amount of different ones and all at different weights. So the same with your guy lines. I mean, how far do you want to go with it? There's so many things you can consider. Now, the only other thing that's probably worth mentioning at this point is the order of pitch. So you've generally got two tents. You've got outer pitch first, inner pitch first. Inner pitch first can sometimes be lighter because the structure is simpler. Essentially, the inner is fastened to the actual structure, and then the outer fly sheet goes over the top. With an outer pitch tent, the outer fly sheet is what is fixed to the structure of the poles, and then the inner is clipped to the outer. The difference in weight isn't really that big. It's essentially what it boils down to is the fact that inner pitch tent first were designed with hotter, drier climates in mind. Outers were designed more with wetter, colder climates in mind. And the reason for that is, if you're pitching a tent and it's heavy rain coming down and windy, an inner pitch tent first, the inner is going to get wet. It might not get soaking wet, but it's going to get water on it. If it's outer pitch first, that ain't going to happen. And that's the difference. Now, the more you practice with an inner pitch first tent, the quicker you'll get, the better you'll get at it, which then means you reduce the impact of any water getting on it. But it's not possible to not get water on it if it's raining when you're pitching. It's just not. And when you're taking the tent down, you've got the same problem. If it's raining, you've got a chance of getting the inner wet. So if you don't want a tent that's got a chance of really getting a wet inner, then you probably don't want to be looking at an inner pitch first tent. And so that's another thing to consider. Now, my advice in terms of how to decide what tent you're going to get is you consider all the things I've mentioned, but do a little bit of research. Go into Google, look at different types of tents. I mean, there's hundreds of manufacturers out there, and each one makes multiple tents generally. So the amount of selection you've got is enormous. Have a look and see what shape and style and type of tent you think you're interested in. Then drill down into the details, what's the weight of it? What's the pack size? Is it inner or outer pitch first? How big's the vestibules? What's the inner height? What's the inner length? Because depending upon whether you're a tall person or a short person, that's going to impact your choice of tent as well. Once you've fixed your eye on a particular type of tent, my next piece of advice is go onto YouTube, have a look at reviews of that type of tent, of which there will probably be a lot, because there's reviews of pretty much every tent that exists, to be honest. Now, whilst some of the influencers on YouTube are bought and paid for, they will tell you whatever the company that supplied the tent wants them to say. There's a lot like that. Some of the biggest ones are the least trustworthy in that respect, from my experience. But it doesn't matter. All you do is pay attention to what they're telling you about the tent. What interior storage has it got, like pockets and things? Has it got clips for you to put your night light on? Not that that's a big issue in Sweden either. Can the doors be rolled right back? Is there good ventilation? All of these little things. Is there any little tips and tricks to make it easier? So you can still learn all that kind of stuff without actually listening to the advert. That some of them are blatantly adverts. So that's the next good option. And then once you've done that and you've drilled it down, if you can, and I appreciate not everybody has access to this, but if you can get to a good outdoor store often they will have a tent area where they have a bunch of tents pitched, and the one you're interested in may be one of those. The really good stores will occasionally have an area where you can actually pitch a tent of your choosing. Outdoor Excel in Rotterdam, I know that one. I bought a tent from there a year ago, Vexel Pioneer 2, and they allowed me to pitch that tent in the store so I could see how easy it was to pitch, and you know, you got a better feel for the tent, I think. And so that can impact your decision as well. Once you've done that, it's then a case of just biting the bullet and picking the one you want and running with it. Unless you know somebody who has a particular tent that you're after, and they might let you try it out, even better. But failing that, if you get to a point where you still can't quite decide, it might be worthwhile coming onto the Facebook page and asking the question, anybody got experience of this type of tent? What's it like in wind? What's it like for this or that and the other? And ask like specific questions. Once you've done all of that, you've got to have an idea of what tent you want, essentially. Once you've made your choice, you've picked your tent. The last piece of advice I want to give really is that once you've got to the point, you've got this tent, pitch it and strike it, pitch it and strike it, pitch it and strike it. Honestly, practice, practice, practice. Whenever I get a new tent, I will put it up and take it down in my back garden 10 times, 10, 15 times. I don't care how many times, not until I get it right, but until I can't get it wrong. And once I've done that, and I'm at that point, and I'm happy that I can pitch that tent in any conditions, on any given day, with no problems, only then will I take it out and use it on a camp. Because I don't want to get myself in a situation where it's blowing a hooligan, it's lashing down rain, and I'm trying to figure this tent out, because that's not ideal. If you know what you're doing, you've taught yourself how to do this tent, because you might even find a slightly quicker way of doing it than what the manual tells you, what the instructions say. That's often the case, to be fair. And once you've got it so that you can bang that tent up easily in any scenario, you're laughing, because when you're on the trail, you might get a checkpoint at the end of the day and you're really tired because the weather's been crap. So you're cold, you're wet, you're hungry, and you're putting your tent up and you get a bit of sort of brain fog and you make a mistake. If you've drilled that tent into you so that you can put that up without even really thinking, that's much less likely to happen. And if that's less likely to happen, you're more likely to be quickly into your tent, changed into warm clothes, and you've got your coffee on the go, or whatever it is you're having, soup, food, whatever it may be. If the weather's nice, it's not so much of a problem. You can take your time pitching your tent and enjoy the weather. But the first 3 nights on Sweden last year, the weather conditions were pretty stark, to be fair. Windy, very wet, cold. So when you got to camp, you just wanted to get your tent up, get inside and chill out, get warm and calm down. So that's basically it. That's for tents. I will be doing more as time goes on. The next one I want to do, I think, is probably going to be leave no trace principles, which has been mentioned by a few people. And one last thing to mention, honestly, if you've got any questions, right, there's so many sources of information for this stuff within the community, if you like. So you've got the Fjällräven Classic official page, which has like 20,000 members. And if you can't get an answer there, you're going to struggle anywhere, to be fair. That one's run by Mail and Jeroen, and they're both experienced guys as well. They can tell you a bunch of stuff, and as can a lot of people there. The page that I'm posting this in, the Sweden Classic, there's like, 1,500, 1,600 people in there, of which I know a bunch of them, and they are very, very good, very experienced, and they can answer questions really well. The Facebook event page, not the Facebook, the Fjällräven Classic event page themselves, they have a bunch of information on there, and I would suggest that everybody read it and read it again, because you do see a lot of questions crop up and they're the same question, and that's fine. And a lot of them, the answer is on the classic page. So honestly, do yourself a favor, read the page, and you'll pick up a bunch of stuff from there. Yes, some of the stuff on the page, you might read it and you think, oh, well, that hasn't really answered my question. And then fine, come to the Facebook page and ask there. Somebody will know, because, I mean, there's people there that have done the classic in Sweden like 10 times. So there's a lot of sources of information. Like you say, everybody in the group's happy to help, generally speaking. Like, everyone I know is happy to help anyway. And if I can answer a question, I will, and I know the other ones will. And if I don't know the answer, I kind of don't like not knowing the answers. So if I don't know, then I'm the type of person who'll go and do a deep dive and find out what the answer is to either come back to you or just for my own peace of mind. But yeah, so, feel free to ask questions. Maybe have a scroll down first and see if somebody's already asked it, and then it might save you the bother, But yeah, if there's anything you want to know, shout up. So until the next one, thanks for watching.